Thanks so much for that introduction, and also I'd like to thank very much the Graham Foundation for both hosting me and funding the book, which would not be colour if it weren't for their contribution, and it's a great honour to be associated with the Graham. This book is, in a way, I had an interview earlier with a gentleman from Landscape Architecture magazine who was asking about the kind of biographical basis, and it's kind of a relevant place to start because my original background is as a gardener and then a landscaper, and it was only through a sort of series of serendipitous circumstances that I ended up in landscape architecture. And I spent, I suppose, the rest of my, at least the rest of my sort of research career trying to reconcile the differences between having worked for, you know, I mean, not a massive amount of time, but maybe sort of somewhere between 5 and 7 years as a gardener, and then the following sort of 20 or 15 to 20 years as a landscape architect. And trying to bring those two things together, the practice of landscape architecture, which is sort of representational, and the practice of gardening, which is very much one-to-one, real-time, often full of very banal things like sweeping paths and prior to the blower machines, cleaning up, and in a way just sort of looking at the landscape change. And so the book is sort of situated in that space between the two disciplines, and I'm going to sort of rush through it a little. Give you an overview of the arguments of each of the chapters, and to start with, I'll sort of describe the way it's put together. It's got two parts to it. The first part is called Figuring Growth, and the second part is called Gardening Design. Figuring Growth is really focused on the way that design tends to be a representational practice. How when we design a landscape, we're really operating within a sort of paradigm that's come to us through architecture, and that our sense of proposition is tied to an imagining of the future. And in a way, in this first section, I call it Figuring Growth because I'm really interested in the way that there's this dynamic between this design practice and the future condition of what's imagined and what really happens. And the three case studies, it's very case study based, the three case studies all look at that dynamic between the sort of form of the plan and the eventual reality of growth. And the second part is called Gardening Design because it's really about gardens that have developed without a plan per se, and where gardeners have thought in a design way to inform what they've done in the landscape over time. So you could treat it as a sort of like a thread that goes from a predictive space, moving through these into a sort of one-to-one, real-time, improvisatory space of gardening. But at the same time, it's important to note that I'm not polarising gardening as being non-design or design as being non-gardening necessarily. I end, as a man for my age, with a manifesto, and a manifesto for plants, a very assertive thing for an unassertive medium. In terms of the way that the book is structured, it's got a few pieces of thinking that sort of frame the whole thing that I'll talk to very quickly. And the first one, I frame it, I feel like to some extent it's sort of uncool to talk about form and space in landscape architecture at the moment. The discourse of process and system and infrastructure and the sort of muscularity of process has meant that it's sort of, the idea of talking about space and form is sort of seen as sort of slightly antiquated or at sort of opposition to process. And in this section, in the introduction, I try to say and own the fact that I am interested in a spatial proposition. I do buy into a way of manipulating space and through form. And I'll talk about this idea that really the description of the space that's created by plants in something like an avenue really can never be properly described just by talking about tree centres that are spaced at a certain placement. Yet that placement is really based around an idea of what will happen over time. So every time we place two lines and then we space dots along those two lines, we're imagining a future of growth. But we know from ourselves that actually growth is not linear and that actually we change over time. So that sort of spatial and formal language is really important to the book. Another thing that's quite important to recognise, and something I'm sort of very interested in from my horticulture background, is around the sort of biology of plants, which is to say that in a way there's a difference between a plant and a brick. A plant is something that has DNA, it's something that changes over time. We share DNA with a plant. It has the same sort of changes and discontinuities that we have. And in a way, the ability to talk about plants is always simultaneously both biological, it's both from the domain of science, as well as actually being from the domain of aesthetics. And the language I utilise all the way through is to try to pair aesthetics and biology together. And I'm also really interested in the fact that plants are weird in the same way that people are weird. They have their own rationales and ways of doing things. They have their own interests. They influence their environment. We know that they inhibit growth of some species. They encourage growth in other species. And in actual fact, they're far from being mute. And there's a lot of discussion in philosophy at the moment by people like Michael Marder about the idea that, that in a way our animalocentric account for life hasn't given plants their due as sort of willful organisms. And finally, I'm very interested in, and this is framing the whole book, I'm very interested in the fact of this transition in the discipline between landscape gardening and landscape architecture. And I think Tim Baird has written quite convincingly about the professionalisation of landscape architecture. Pardon me. And I think that to some extent my own experience as a blue-collar worker prior to being a white-collar worker has informed this. And there's values, I think, that come from the one-to-one relationship with plants that can enrich landscape architecture. And that divide, the fact that over time so much will happen that will determine what the resulting plant condition will be, that if we don't take account for that, we face inevitable disappointment as our static vision of the future never actually quite delivers what we planned. Instead, I'm going to propose, let's actually embrace the change that arises and work in a curatorial way over time with what's happening. And so to move on to the case studies in the figuring growth section, I start with one particular garden. And the whole book has a kind of, it's quite polemic. My editor, Roger Canova from MIT, was very, even though in my PhD, my supervisor hated the polemical, Roger Canova embraced it. And so, in a way, the book starts from a sort of a series of stories for each chapter which govern how the case studies were chosen. And this first one starts from a garden that's in France that's called Chateau Kouros. And it's a garden that not everyone's heard of. And I discovered it in quite a random way. I was a research assistant, a research fellow actually, for Richard Weller at the University of Western Australia in the early 2000s. And I had the opportunity to travel to Europe, and he said to me, Rackers, you've got to visit the old gardens to actually really understand them. And so I did that. And in the process of, prior to Google Maps, I had this book by Penelope Hobhouse called The Gardens of Europe there. And, I was sort of driving dangerously sort of with the map here and before we had these devices. And I saw this sort of line as I was passing one particular place. It said, if this was it's said to be a garden by André Lenotte, but if it was by Lenotte, then he was in an unusually romantic frame of mind. And that was enough for me to decide to pull over to the side of the road and talk my way into that garden. And it was an interesting garden for me, and it was interesting a lot because of the fact that I had certain expectations about the Baroque garden. And I think that for my generation, and a lot of this book is sort of situated within a body of theory which might even seem antiquated from the 90s, but it was where I think there's been a sort of discontinuity in landscape architectural thinking, and I sort of consciously have reached back into some of that. And Alan Weiss, his Mirrors of Infinity book and his writing about Anamorphosis Absconditus, about Lenotte's Vol au Vicomte, was very influential. And when I went to visit the garden, I have to say, as much as I was awed by this garden, I was also bored by it in a sense that it's sort of predictable perspectival orientation and setting up of its terraces and the way that sculptures were viewed at distance, etc., was less interesting to me than the conditions I found when I reached this transverse canal across here, where suddenly one had to, almost in a kind of Richard Serra way, deviate off the grand axis onto this side canal. And when one did, I was really interested more than anything in this edge here. When you look at the plan of the Baroque garden, it sort of seems like the geometry of the garden is kind of ripped out of the forest, that somehow it sits within the forest. Now, obviously, we know the opposite is true. It is structuring its landscape around it. But what I was really fascinated by is what I call in the book the timed edge, which is the fact that there's this transition between the interior of the garden as a kind of organised formal space and this space in here, which was the which is really a space of regeneration and a space of land management. So essentially this landscape here, and it's been logged a number of times since then, is a place where the forest is regenerating. As I'll discuss in Kouros, essentially it's a sort of selective regenerative thinning procedure that goes on. But in actual fact, this hedge here and the maintenance processes here, in a way, use growth to create the transition between a space of regeneration and a space of a garden. And that role of the edge as a maintenance edge, not necessarily a sort of hard landscape edge, was really fascinating to me. And that's something I saw at Kouros. And at Kouros, so what I did in the garden is I sort of tried to understand how the garden had changed, the spatial effects of the garden had changed over time. This group of trees here, these plane trees here are quite interesting. They're really the trees that Hobhouse and Scully and others talk about in terms of this idea of the romance of Lenotte. In actual fact, the owner of the garden is quite clear that it was not a Lenotte garden. They have a piece of paper where Lenotte's father was providing a quote to work on the garden, and then a piece of paper that rejects the quote. And so, in actual fact, interestingly, the garden over 500 years developed a lot and quite differently according to different horticultural treatments. And in the book, I sort of map out how a series of different sort of fashions of planting, whether it's contre allées, whether it's using yew, whether it's using cypress, etc., until finally it goes to the plane tree. I talk about this in terms of this idea of a kind of a flexing and changing edge, that over time those trees have imbued that edge with a whole lot of different spatial effects. The plan is relatively the same, and it's actually only the spatial effects that really result from the planting that give it that quality. And I keep going back to this because in a way I'm always trying to show the design cannot give the only account for the spatial effects that we find. If we look at this garden over time, it's fascinating to sort of look at all of the range of different sorts of spaces that result from the different horticultural treatments, and I try to sort of look at how simply planting and maintenance changes of surfaces create highly differentiated spatial conditions. Interestingly, the current owners of this landscape are managing it in a really interesting way. So here we have the space of the garden. In here, one of the canals at Kouros, and this space here is actually a regenerating landscape where they use a tractor slasher that's at a spacing where they drive it through and they turn it and they leave about 3 metre spacing between it. Then they drive it through again. Whatever comes up in the unslashed part begins to compete for light, etc., to move up. And then they go through again later and they just cut what survived and they make a decision about what the forest nature is on the basis of the existing success of those trees that are left in the gaps behind the slashing procedure. And so in a way, that garden, the first thing is to talk about one of the kind of key angles actually about this, the argument I make is that in the long term, it's actually more about the client than it's about the designer. The designer over a longer period of time is almost irrelevant. We glorify designers continually, but in actual fact, if we look at this garden, what we discover is multiple people went broke, revolutions happened, things survived, the Nazis invaded, they took certain things out, the British came in, they occupied, things didn't happen, and the romantic state of these trees result from key times when those trees were unpruned and somebody else coming in later and saying, you know what, I quite like that character, I'm going to let it go, I'm not trying to pull it back to what it was. And so that finding is really important because it straight away dislodges that idea that it's all about the designer and says, well, maybe it's not all about the designer, maybe it's about the client. And so that sense of the backstory is something that really is very interesting to me. And, you know, we have Australians are troublemakers, and so a good place to make trouble is the Billa Garden. It's one of the most famous pieces of landscape architecture around, largely on the basis of the fact that it's seen as an icon of planting design. And if you sort of look at it and you read the great writing by Gary Hildebrand and others, and Gary was very nice enough to read my draft quite thoroughly. And you know, a lot of the time they talk about the idea that the honey locust alley, which is this sort of space along here, that space really came into its own at key points, like it was mature. But interestingly, when I read the language about it, I was really interested in the fact that in actual fact, the argument that I was making, and I have to thank a student, Frank Kleinsmith, for pointing this out in a tutorial, which is that in a way, this is a drawing that's by Greg Bleem from Modern Landscape Architecture, and the argument that I make is that this is actually an architectural analogue, which is to say, because the garden is in a way not about growth, these trees themselves actually are operating like columns. And so this chapter is called Architecture with Plants, and I sort of have this series of these sort of graphics where I try to sort of bring out a key piece of argument between the chapters, which is in a way to say that, and this is what Frank, my student, said, is this a garden at all if it's actually about plants operating like architecture? And a lot of the writing operates like that. But when you dig into the garden, what you discover is that actually the trees are not consistent. And so in the process of saying, we say it emerged fully grown after the millers sort of pass away, it emerges fully grown, but in actual fact we know that across the time of this garden it was planted and then replanted twice, and along the time every single tree in it on each time was replaced between those times at least twice, at least once, some twice, and that in the process the millers were asking for bigger and bigger trees to try to keep that architectural effect static. And so for me, this was a key moment to say, I'm interested in the garden as something that's about growth. I'm interested in the fact that a key attribute of any landscape architectural project that utilises vegetation has to be growth. It has to be about the biological in some sense. Otherwise, we're moving into a space where we're talking about architecture on another scale, or external architecture, external works, as architects used to call it on projects that I used to work on. And so I was really interested in that kind of backstory. And in the archive of the Indianapolis Museum of Art, there was a whole lot of amazing drawings that document all of that. And so here's a drawing where all of these trees are the ones that were being replaced at certain points in time on an earlier drawing. And so we can really start to pick up how difficult it was to maintain that architectonic effect, because growth conditions around the species themselves was causing problems. It was a monoculture, the canopies are growing into each other. When it got pests and diseases, they ran right through the whole lot. The soil conditions were, when the terrace was made, caused a whole lot of problems. And so in actual fact, this icon of planting design was in itself a horticultural disaster. And so that's an interesting idea. Does that matter? Probably not in some sense. And so if you think about the sense that it doesn't matter, and so it all actually grew out of the fact that when I finally visited the Billa Garden, it looked like this, instead of the photos that Gary was showing me, which are the photos that looked like this. And so obviously something had happened. But the reason it was an icon of planting design largely is because of the fact that a sort of language of plants was developing in modernism, largely because of the work, I would say, of James Rose. And so one of my key sort of heroes in the book, and I'm sure all of you know him, is the work of James Rose. This is his sort of plant taxonomy from Creative Gardens from the 50s. And it was really important, I think, because obviously the sort of story we're told around it from Tribe et al.'s writing about it is around the idea that the Harvard guys were trying to find a way of adapting the Bauhaus languages towards the specificities of the landscape condition. But obviously it's an attempt to try to say, what are the different qualities that each of these plant forms have in formal terms? Now that's something that interests me. But what really interested me was that there was never a point where there was a discussion about what happened between the plant being this big and the plant being this big. In actual fact, that's always implicit. The idea that we're showing and representing a final condition is never really discussed. Yet a gardener's work and labour and a client's dedication is implicit all the way through there to get to that effect. And so talking about that planting design language abstractly from maintenance strikes me as disingenuous. So on the one hand, I'm very interested and a big fan of the kind of innovations around a language of planting design, but embedded within it is something that in the book I talk about in terms of deconstruction, which is to say, if you go back to Wigley's writing about deconstruction, he would say that a kind of deconstructive investigation is to get the root of the discipline and reveal its foundation, to undermine it and redefine it. And that's something which I sort of am trying to do in this book. So that moves me into the into the third garden and the final garden in the first section, which is this garden, the garden Marnas by Sven-Ingvar Andersen. Now, I know about this garden largely through the writings of Anne Spirn and her language of landscape, which was hugely influential on me. And, you know, this is Sven-Ingvar Andersen. I was on the one hand lucky enough to meet him before he died, but unlucky enough that I never got to visit the garden with him. And so the photos that I knew and that Spirn really utilised in her book was these classic photos of the garden. And so the way that Andersen talked about this garden, and I mean, if you don't know Andersen's work, he's an extraordinary landscape architect in the sort of Scandinavian tradition after C.T.H. Sorensen. And so in this garden, he talked about this rather whimsically, and it's sort of his practice is situated between modernism and postmodernism. This is the hen yard he talked about. And on the one hand, it's a playful element, but he had a really serious story that came from it, which is to say, the hen yard, he said, and this is through Spirn that I discovered this, he said that ultimately the hen yard is a hen yard for as long as I have the energy to climb a ladder and prune these hawthorns. And if I don't prune them, the hen yard will turn into a hawthorn grove. So embedded within that plant is the potential of it both being a hen and it being a tree. And the only differentiation about what it is will be around how it's maintained. And for me, this is a really interesting idea and gets to, again, this idea of the role of maintenance, which I will argue is not a great word, in how that happens. Now, I've been very interested in the kind of, and I feel really embarrassed by this, which is that there's two plans where one of them is upside down. This is a first-year error. I mean, I would fail for this, I should. But this is the original drawing of Andersen's design, which, of course, it's always great to see. This is a diagram. It's not a planting plan. It's not an illustrative drawing. It's a diagram. And so when I visited the garden, I came in through the wrong end of the garden, which in itself is always a great thing, I think, because a lot of the time we're used to the sort of the photographic record of the garden setting up a certain sequence. And one of the nice things about some writing around site specificity and the term that Giraud talks about landing is that first moment where you enter a landscape with certain expectations only to discover that the site confuses you, throws you on a different tangent, gives you a different way of reading the site. And so I was heading for the hawthorn grove, heading for what I hoped would be the hawthorn grove, but what I discovered was in fact that this hawthorn grove was still a hen yard. And it was a hen yard because the children, or Bita Andersen, the daughter of Sven-Ingvar and her husband, continued to maintain the hens as hens because that's what their father had done, and this was his garden, and so the figure, the shape of the hen was super important to them. Whereas in actual fact, what was more interesting to me was the fact that the rest of the landscape was completely different than what I'd expected. The photo I'd seen had shown the edges of the rooms like this, as sort of hedged rooms, and indeed later photographs had also shown them like this, but somewhere between those photos and the end, spaces like, spaces like this had developed, which is to say spaces where the trees had been allowed to grow up, where lower limbs had been removed, and where in actual fact the planting plan was exactly the same. And so if I measured, which I did, I measured these trees out. They're all on the hawthorns are all on a 500 mil split, rational European metric system. We have a 500 mil spacing, and most of the time those species are still located in exactly the same location, but the spatial result that comes out of it is radically different. So you could not actually describe this garden just by reading the planting plan. In actual fact, the only way you could understand it is the fact that maintenance and ecological conditions over time had caused other spaces to result, and Andersen had chosen to go with it or let them happen. Now that's a luxury, obviously. As a designer, the reason why gardens are these laboratories for people is that people have the agency to be able to keep working with them. And one of the challenges in the book is to say, how do we work with gardens or landscapes, public landscapes over longer time frames? And so my argument is that you can't get this outcome unless you garden, unless you allow for a change to occur from a condition which you'd been maintaining for a 20-year period, and then a decision, for whatever reason, to let the landscape go in certain ways. And all of the spatial effects that we found in the garden, whether it be the creation of different sorts of forms in the landscape, whether it be views that penetrate through those lines that in the planting plan look consistent, all of those can only happen through maintenance. And so maintenance has to be part of the process. But still, Anderson's key argument for me, which I was fascinated with, is this one, which is to say that through a process of traumatic reiteration, which is the process where the apical meristem is removed, and then after that changes in the concentration of auxin allow for side branching to occur. Through that process and the time, the location of the bud, and the period when it happens, we get enormous spatial variation to the point where from one species we can get a hedge, we can get a shrub, and we can get a small tree, all from the one plant, just on the basis of the fact of how we maintain it. That kind of virtuosity of a plant, that kind of virtuosity of a medium, is something that really excites me. And that's where I coined this term, the viridic. Now, it's a kind of, it's like coining a term is one of those things you only get to do so often. I embraced it. And I sort of, in this book, I try to give it, to have a little bit of arrogance around plants in terms of the idea that plants are kind of an interesting and unique material for landscape architecture. And I use the term viridic because I thought to myself, what's the kind of tectonic of plants, If architecture has this tectonic, what's the tectonic for plants? And so the viridic is interesting because I was, procrastinating. There's a lot of procrastinating that happens when one works on a book. And so I was in a library procrastinating, walking around, and there was in the art library, there was a whole series of books on the history of colour. And I found the book On Green, because it seemed like the least procrastinating kind of book I could look at that moment. And I discovered, of course, it's, the term viridesco was the colour for green, but also that word also had the term viridarium, which is a garden, so the colour is tied to the garden. It also had the fact that the concept of spring was tied to it. And so in a way it seemed that the colour and growth were inherent. And so I coined this term, the viridic, to also get the fact that when we go back into Semper, which is where everyone went to go to get the tectonic from, his original definitions and the way he built them was around a few things. One is the material and its qualities. Two is the techniques that go with the material that allow it to be manipulated, and a kind of caricature of the trade. And so the tectonic was about the carpenter, it was about timber, it was about the chisel, it was about those things. And it seemed to me that plants had that relation, which is to say, to understand this sequence here, we had to understand the way that the action of the gardener works with the material of plants. And so the argument that I make, and the key argument in the whole book, is that it's not the fact that we're working with plants, we're working with growth. We're working with transformation. Our material is transformation. Any ability to describe it in its mature condition is ignoring all of those other conditions along the way. It's like saying to somebody, we're going to ignore you until you get to 60. Maybe the young people probably think that is actually what's going on, but we actually are mature and have our qualities at every point in time. When do we allow plants to have those qualities? We're always pitching them towards this future condition. So the viridic is a way to try to take that into consideration. So that's the first half of the book, really based around this dynamic between representation, drawing, the predictive aspects of plants, and then the way that maintenance, in a way, has created spatial outcomes that are beyond the design, that could not be counted from simply from the planting design or from the drawing that was produced X many years ago. That those qualities can only come from maintenance. Now, the reason I don't like maintenance is the same reason why Nicholas Nassim Taleb doesn't like resilience, which is to say it's a kind of backwards term. Resilience, there's no fun future in resilience, And so, Nicholas Nassim Taleb talks about anti-fragility, which is to say that something comes back more from disturbance. And we know ecologically that that's true. You can plant something or you could disturb a landscape, and that's another way to get more out of it. So in the second half of the book, called Gardening Design, instead I move out of the sort of predictive into the one-to-one real-time space of gardening. And the first, because the transition in a way is the sort of background discussion in here around modernism, the callback from modernism during the postmodern period into the Baroque, etc. Now, and so Bill Marx is a nice place to build a bridge between a drawn representational landscape practice and a gardening-based landscape practice. Pardon me. And so his garden, which is the CTO Roberto Bill Marx in outside of Rio, is a really interesting example to use in this sense because, as he would say, the garden was his laboratory. It was the place, he said, it's the place in which he learnt everything he knew as a landscape architect in terms of practice. And so, interestingly, that garden I discovered it because I was visiting and people had said you must visit it and it was amazing. But then later when I was working on the book, I discovered a blog that was in Portuguese by a guy called Ribeiro Dias, the wonders of Google Translate, right? You can just decide to search in another language. And so I discovered Ribeiro Dias, who'd been the director of the CTO Roberto Bill Marx, and he talked about this garden on the basis of it being a laboratory. Now, if you go to the garden, you know, it's in a way, it's important to understand this garden as a laboratory versus as an exhibit, because ultimately his blog post was really a fight with his employer, because the employer was the patrimony or the manager, the government manager of the garden. He was the director, and they kept trying to basically turn it into a museum of Bill Marx's planting techniques. And he kept saying, no, it was a laboratory. It's a place of experimentation. And so you're trying to make it into a collection of techniques and planting design arrangements, of which it had all of those things to it. You know, it had a lot of the sort of qualities that they were talking about, but ultimately his argument was that really it was a place of experimentation, and that experimentation had to continue for it to be what it was. And so interestingly, and you know, it has all of this, as he would call it, you know, the correlated textures, and he had a whole lot of, Gary Doherty, a friend of mine, has just been recently released, also with Graham Foundation support, I think, released his lectures. And you know, one of the things, you know, he was from that period which I was educated where it was about mass planting, and so he would say, you can't show people one plant because the public won't see it. You've got to show them 100 of that plant, and then finally they go, oh, look, it's a plant. And so that his strategy was really, in that sort of way, very different from the kind of perennial Udolph sort of language that we're working with these days. And so, as a process, what Bill Marx did really is he did these long plant excursions where he would collect plants, and I got to meet a number of the then young boys that went on those trips with Bill Marx, where, you know, they'd be in the back of a pickup truck, you know, deep in the Amazon, and Bill Marx would say, I see a bromeliad, and send off a young guy to climb up the thing and, you know, presumably fight off snakes and bugs and spiders and all that horrible stuff, and not, you know, get accidentally ingesting, you know, hallucinogenic plants and stuff, and then would pull that down. And that process he called to get. And he had this two-stage process, which was to get and to use. He would then bring the plants back to the garden and then put them in the shade house where they would acclimate. And then after that, put them in the garden in multiple different locations to say, here I put this plant, and this is the same plant in one of those things. There it is from where it was collected and put into the shade house, and here's another space in the garden where it's used. He put in full sun, lots of water. You know, full sun, no water, partial sun, etc. And he would just look at how the plant did. And out of that, he would make a decision around what the Dutch wave guys like Hank Gerritsen, Rob Hendricks, the people who were associated with Piet Udolph, Hank Gerritsen called ecological amplitude, which is the range of situations that the plant can live in. And so that was a really interesting process. But one thing that I sort of had I created a bit of a straw man in this scenario. And so this is an example of, it's also the biggest collection of Ariaceae plants, which is to say the plants in the aroid family. And so here is a kind of classic planting configuration where all of the sort of aroid plants are pulled out to give you a sense of how he was using them. One problem I kind of had with the way that Dias was talking about the garden, and a problem I have generally, which is the separation of the biological from the aesthetic. And there's a tendency generally at the moment, or has been, to sort of what I call science, sort of have a sort of scientist view or a scientification, or a, what's the right word? Anyway, like treating everything like science and only valuing the scientific at the moment in what I call the process discourse of landscape urbanism, etc. In actual fact, the argument I make is that we can't neatly separate the biological from the aesthetic. And here's a simple thought experiment to say, which is that you'll never put, if you don't understand the scientific in some sense, you're not going to be able to grow it. There's always an implicit understanding of the scientific involved in horticulture. It has to get watered. It has to be able to handle that ecological situation. So science is embedded there. And also, who puts a plant in a garden that they don't like? And so those two are always meaning that the scientific and the aesthetic are joined. Now, this is an important thing for me because I think that, you know, to some extent, the aesthetic has had a very bad name for quite a while. And I think that the return of interest in planting design through Pete Udolph's work particularly, obviously there's lots of other people in that same vein, working at the moment. All of that work, to some extent, is in the process of rediscovering an aesthetic of plants. And I think that's a worthy thing. It always has to be tied to science. And what I look in this chapter, finally, is I look at the idea of plant functional type. Plant functional type is a way to do that. Plant functional type says that a plant is evolved to a certain condition and that its morphological characteristics arise from an adaptation to that condition. Now, if we look at the way that the work of the Dutch wave, Udolph et al. Is working, it's like you have an algorithm that has a whole lot of parts in it. It might have herbs, grasses, etc. It might have a climatic condition, a Mediterranean climatic condition, say, to an area that I'm familiar. And then within that, we can substitute in and out species that occur within that sort of plant functional type space in there. So we can have a grass from South Africa with a shrub from Australia, with a tree from the Mediterranean, and we're working within a sort of plant functional type relationship across locations. And that's my way of trying to say there's a correlation between the aesthetic and the scientific. And obviously with Bill Marx's work, we can see here from this example that, when we see a kind of classic piece of Bill Marx planting and we visit it now, and we can still see the ghosting of that figure, we know gardening was always implicit in that work. And gardening is always implicit in planting design. Whether it's as simple as the fact that your planting failed, a gardener pulled it out and replaced it, that's still an implicit gardener there. Or whether it's a gardener who somehow has a sympathetic understanding of what you're trying to do, the gardener is always present. Now, in my other two case studies in the book, what I also look at then is once I've given up drawing as the primary mode of designing for landscape and moved into the garden, I try to look at other representational ways of dealing with landscape, other design conceptions that are not based around design as drawing. Now, of course, we know disegno is actually a word that design is always about drawing in a classical sense. But I'm also arguing design is a way of strategic thinking. And we know these days with the process discourse and landscape urbanism, increasingly design has also moved into a thought space. And so this garden is one called Drumschadein, and again it's a result from procrastination, which is that when I was doing my PhD, I was living in Fremantle in Perth in Australia. I was a fellow at the University of Western Australia, and I was procrastinating. I went to a bookstore, and in the gardening section, I found this book called Some Branch Against the Sky by this guy called Geoffrey Dutton. Now, Dutton was called The Practice and Principles of Marginal Gardening. Pardon me. And interestingly, one of the perks of this job is that I get to have wine before the lecture. And so I was just fascinated by this idea of marginal gardening, and it struck me as a nice sort of concept to work with. And so I dug into this book a little bit, and he was a real character, Geoffrey Dutton. For one thing, what we know about the metabolism of any pharmacological drugs, we now know through his work, which was about how drugs enzymes were working in the body to break down and consume to get the effects of drugs, and that's something we know about from his research. But at the same time, he was a kind of classic sort of Renaissance guy. On the one hand, he was a mountaineer. He was also a swimmer, and he took these amazing photos of underwater landscapes and forests that he would then photograph as landscapes under the water. I mean, he was a kind of classic, where is he? You know, there he is in there. He was a kind of classic English Scottish gentleman. And the garden was interesting because the way that it worked was, his idea of the marginal garden was the garden that was minimally differentiated from its environment. So that was one idea of the marginal garden. Another idea is that it was on the margins, and when you visit that landscape in Scotland, you visit the garden, you know, this is the landscape, the garden was on the margin between this sort of higher alpine zone and the zone of trees, so it was on that margin. It was also on the margin between an agricultural system and an indigenous landscape system, and for him the most important one was that it was the marginal, he only had a marginal amount of time to really work on it. And I was really interested in this because one of the things that I think has been really lost in landscape architecture, but it still has been theorised in some sense, is the relationship to site. And I think there have been theorists in the last 10, 15 years who have been focused on site, but to some extent, site has been converted into algorithm, which is to say, whereas site is actually something that is felt, specific, reacted to, engaged with, struggled with, inspired from, etc. To some extent, site has become algorithm of ecological factors where ecology is not treated as a specific description of the relationships of organisms to site, but instead has become something where we can talk about the ecology of workplaces, the ecology of this and that. And I think we have lost a lot of site-based understanding in that process to the point where we speculate on the basis of algorithms rather than site characteristics. And so I was fascinated by this marginal idea, which is that he was really in his landscape simply sort of cutting and grooming the found landscape, inserting certain plants in, and he was really interested in the idea of withdrawing the hand. Now, the designers will generally not withdraw the hand. Generally, it's through the hand that we actually can say this has been designed. And so I was really interested in the way that this landscape actually changes that relationship. Now, in actual fact, over time, what's happened is that his kids have, again, sort of, on the one hand, tried to keep it how their dad had it, but they'd also tried to, they'd sort of stopped these introductions. And one thing I found interesting in a lot of the gardens was this desire to maintain a continuity in a garden over generations in families, but at the same time, a mistaking of the garden as an artefact rather than the garden as a process, which is to say gardens happen through gardening. And so if we regard the outcome of the gardening as a static thing, we mistake the fact that it is the outcome of a growth process. Finally, for this chapter, the thing that is really critical was, I think, his account, which I subscribe to, which is around thermodynamics. And so he spoke, and this is a favourite piece of poetry of his. It's only the simple sunlight on a fence post out of snow, and I come to set it upright at the cost of a single blow. Then I leave them to the sunlight, one straight post, trodden snow. And for me, I like this piece of writing because it gets, on the one hand, to a sort of artifactual thing, which is that there's a kind of a metric around the correcting of the post. There's also a remnant or a trace of the action, which is the footpath. And then there's, for me, a more important thing, which is really around a thermodynamic reading of the garden, which is to say, in the gardening frame, the gardener and the landscape are in a dynamic relationship with each other that is thermodynamic. There's energy exchanges that are happening, and I'm sort of arguing that we need to think about the garden in those terms. Now, finally, my final case study is important because of the fact that it's one where I sort of talk about management directly in terms of thinking about the way that different roles play out on sites over time. This is a fantastic garden that's called Insel Homebrush, which is outside of Dusseldorf, and it was designed originally by a guy called Bernhard Korte. As a landscape, it's an extraordinary project. The series of these sculpture pavilions made by the sculptor viridic are unscripted or unnarrated art galleries. So essentially you walk inside one of these, the works that are in there are curated, but there's no description about what the artwork's name is, who the artist was, and it's simply through your narrative of moving through the landscape and sequencing how you move through it in relationship to those spaces that you really discover what you make for yourself, that sequence. That was part of a collaboration that was happening throughout this project between artists who were part of this thing that Muller, the owner, called a sort of nature, culture, creative project. His argument was that nature is creative, humans are creative, it's part of the same continuum, and he was interested in that as a kind of collaborative process. Other beautiful moments for me are, for example, here's a sort of pavilion you walk into. This is a collection of Khmer heads. We could have a kind of colonial discussion around, post-colonial thing around the fact that these are spoliated things from indigenous sites, but nonetheless, as a piece of orientation, it demonstrates the relation that you have. You move straight in there and the first thing you do is turn, and it's it's got a really fascinating relationship to art. Anyway, the main reason I discovered it originally was because of the fact that horticultural techniques were really extensively utilised in how it's creative. An example of a favourite of mine where a drawing of this might have been a kind of massive vegetation, but in actual fact how the pruning of this has created this sort of differential threshold that one can move through, again, beyond the sort of planting plan description. And in the sort of process of getting there, I discovered the work of this guy whose name is Bernhard Korte. And Korte was the original landscape architect. Now, you couldn't really call him a landscape architect. And a lot of the time, I talk in this book around how, landscape has actually been historically a kind of thing that amateurs did, something that enthusiasts did. And he's a classic example of this. He's a member of the German Institute, but at the same time, never trained, joined through his work. And he was actually a guy who did a PhD in nursery management, who was running an art gallery in Dusseldorf selling Art Deco lamps. And Muller just said, oh, you've done horticulture, do you want to come and do the landscape for my site? And he designed this landscape, which he was really constrained by the fact that in that period, in the 80s, a lot of the municipality was so focused on ecological restoration, they wanted to recreate this Niederrhein landscape. And he personally was totally uninterested in that. He was interested in aesthetics. And what he was particularly interested in was the aesthetics of organisms and the aesthetics of a kind of a human-nature relationship. And so the only way into this for him was to treat that Niederrhein landscape as a cultural landscape. And he talks about how, in actual fact, he said, I could make an argument to them that I could put these pollarded trees in because I said it's antiquated to think about nature as dehumanised, and therefore if you want this indigenous landscape, it has to have people in it because that's the landscape that it was, and these are cultural artefacts in that landscape. And he talks about how when he went to collect those plants, he drove to Belgium, to the Niederrhein sort of landscape over there, and in actual fact the pollarded trees, they had no leaves on them. He got pulled up on the border on the way back to Germany, and he just said, it's firewood. And basically they let him bring in 150 of these pollarded willows because the border guards just thought they were firewood. But that really gets to the fact that the whole landscape for him was entirely composed from the eye. It was actually like a picturesque landscape. The only drawing from that period, he had to nab an architecture student to do this drawing for him for the council. But because he said this is a medium that's ridiculous for this project. The medium has to be around the eye. Now, he ultimately had a falling out with the owner, and 10 years later, this guy, Burkhard Damm, came in. Now, Burkhard was a landscape architect, and the first thing Burkhard had to do was to deal with the consequences of things that Korte had done. And so, for example, when this landscape was installed, the fill that was utilised was all material that had come through from a nearby piggery. And so the soil was so rich that basically it was a landscape of nettles right the way through. And so the first thing he had to do was, over a period of 6 years, was to denutrify the soil by systematically removing vegetation that was sucking up the nutrient. And he was utilising a principle that came from Hank Gerritsen, who I was talking to earlier about the work of the Dutch wave. And Gerritsen's argument was controlling fertility is the biggest thing you can do over time, reducing fertility. Now, this is a very northern hemisphere concept for me, but ultimately too much growth is the problem in landscapes, because the same plants that you want are competing with the plants that you don't want. And so you have to reduce and control nutrient all the way through. Now, the way that Burkhardt worked in this landscape was via a totally different sort of medium. So he worked using a kind of like a geographic framework with spreadsheet over time. And so all of his work was in spreadsheet. And so as he moved into this space of design on site, he was really working on how many people have I got, when do I need influx of money to be able to work with this, what things have to happen at what time. And so his idea of design, I said to him, is this design? He said, absolutely, this is design, because ultimately this whole landscape is a dynamic process, and any idea we have of it as a design idea has to happen through the process of understanding these spreadsheets. And so they are the kind of creative tool that determines what happened when, how, etc. And he used this concept he called the frame. And the frame is to say that for each space in the garden, he had an idea about what that landscape was like. And he called this section here, for example, it's in Germany, right? He called this the tropics. And so his frame for this landscape, even though, I said to him, I'm from the tropics, I know what the tropics really looks like, this doesn't look anything like the tropics. He's like, it's green, there's shade, and it's like, oh, okay. But, at the same time, that sense of the frame, not about its authenticity, its correctness, but the sense of the frame and what he called the leash, which is how far out you'll let that go before you'll actually pull it back in, were the main variables that he was working with. And he had this sort of dynamic conception where things could change within it, but how he kept the frame together would determine how the design intent continued over time. And so the final guy that I met, who was sort of for me this was a really important meeting, was this guy called Klaus. And Klaus was the gardener. And interestingly, and each person I say, as I met each one of them in a different place. I met Dan in the meeting room because he could only give me X amount of time before he went into the next meeting. But Klaus, I met at the ticket entry, and he took me straight in and he said, I want to show you, first of all, he showed me that view that I showed at the start of the Niederrhein landscape and the sort of meadows. And then he said, that's the view that Korte wanted, and this is what I have to deal with. And so he took me to this area that he called the disaster area. And the disaster area was a place where there'd been a storm come through and 100 trees had gone down. And he said, with my 4 gardeners and Burkhardt's spreadsheet, I will never be able to replant this. I will never be able to take these trees out, but I still have a frame that I have to work with. And so suddenly he said, I'm going to have to start to work with regeneration and curating what's coming up in that landscape automatically on itself to be able to create that frame over time, because I will never be able to restore this landscape from scratch. So I'll never go back again. And so for me, that maintenance process and the way that he was going to have to work with that was really fascinating. And a lot of it was, for instance, there's interesting stories about him, for example, just as an aside, this site also had a kind of a rocket station on it. And so Klaus Muller, who was the original owner, had basically bought a NATO rocket station as the museum's major organising area. And this was a museum that Klaus had actually, or that the rocket terminal was a place where Klaus had protested against nuclear arms. So he had a whole other story to talk about this site. But a lot of the work he was doing was about introductions and naturalizations. And he would walk you to areas where you'd start to see certain species, and he would say, all I've been doing in this area is trying to naturalise a fern for 3 years. It's taken me 3 years to work out the right fern, and only now is it starting to take off. Now, in another context, in the context of a garden, that sort of naturalisation that's potentially what we're actually looking for there is weedy conditions. Instead, we're looking for a plant that is actually going to overtake what we want. That makes it a weed. So one of the key arguments is in this book is around those plant categories. So finally, that's all the case studies. And so I end the book with what I call a sort of a manifesto for the viridic. And in that manifesto, I set out a series of relationships and key things that I'm interested in. And one of those is about changing the relationship between plants and people, which is about recognising that we share a space, a temporal continuum with plants, that we share biological characteristics with them, that changes everything about what they are as a material for our discipline. Another one I talk about, and this is probably the one for the whole thing, which is that plant material is growth. It's not like a piece of timber sculpture. It's growth, it's transformation. That's the material. How do we engage with it? That has massive implications for how we practice. And that also means that therefore we have to start working with maintenance as something that's explicit in the design process. It's not something that's an appendage to the end to say, when you maintain this garden, please ensure that it looks exactly like I'm intending it in this drawing in 20 years' time. And to get there, please do all of these things, and if you don't do them, it's a catastrophe. It's about really treating maintenance as a creative process. And part of that is about regulating and accepting the environment. And I think that all of the gardens I've looked at work because of the fact that they have a very site-specific understanding of the growing conditions of that landscape, and they have a trial and error relationship to what happens on site. They're a learning experience, and that's incredibly important. Also, when we're working with plants, we're working with form and process simultaneously. We can't separate those things out. This is a bit of a side about landscape urbanism, which treats process and form as just the outcome of a process, but I think it's a dynamic relationship, and part of that is that biology and aesthetics are not separate. It's also, I think, about action and not about representation. There's a tendency in design at the moment, and I think a lot of it's because academics, myself included, we work in representational spaces as much or more than we work in practice situations, and because of that, and because also the tools of representation have become so potent, and we know those dripping collages that have so much atmosphere, it's it's unbelievable, but we know them. And so in a way, I think we're over-accepting what representation is really doing. And you have that horror when I talk to students, it's like, I want a black and white plan. And even though I'm not into that, what I try to say is if you can't tell me what you're going to do to get to that collage, then your project is actually not what you're showing me. As I said, the viridic is a learning practice, and learning is something that can only happen in the field. And also that we have to work with gardening as a feedback tool, which is to say anything that works with growth has to work with feedback. You have to work with emergent characteristics. If you just work with models, which is to say I'm modelling what's going to happen in time, you're not working with growth because you can't simulate growth. It's the same as you can say, I can do a whole lot of mapping of coin tosses and I can come up with a statistical probability of a coin toss, but when the coin is tossed, you cannot guess what it's going to be. And it's the same. Modelling is on the one hand something that's sort of very enticing but highly dangerous. And I think that that's why, for instance, Brad Cantrell's work interests me because it's about this responsiveness. And finally, and most importantly, the viridic entails a change of practice. And that's probably the most, to end at this point is a provocative place to end because it actually leaves so much still to think about in relationship to practice. And I think that in a way, we have some models of people like Gilles Clément, etc. But in actual fact, that challenge is probably the most important challenge in the book, and therefore a provocative place to end. Thank you.
Your talk is incredible, and I just want to thank you. I'm an artist, and I work a lot with choreography and dance works, and I live part of the time in Chicago and part of the time in California, and the growth of meadows that are like neglected has become such a big part of my practice. And I love the fact that in landscape architecture there is a gap in Western landscape architecture to really describe what you're terming the viridic. And in some places, the viridic, that kind of surplus growth, is the default, and then you have to be humble to kind of move with that growth and cut it back and learn from it. And I love that you've actually mapped this, and this will become part of the canon, which is so exciting.
Thank you.
And I'm just wondering, what's exciting you right now in terms of a recent place you've been, or do you have a space that you would want to design or live within?
I think there's a number of thank you very much for those comments. I think that obviously, since this is a piece of research that happened before I moved to South Africa, and that I've been working with, that I've been, in a way, it's a thinking that arose prior to coming to South Africa, and that was sort of in the transition. And so I have to say that South Africa has changed everything about how I think about my discipline and how I think about everything. And so in a way, it's like it's such a radical change, it's hard to really even think about it. And the writing that's come after, some of which has been published in a folio which is published by the University of Johannesburg, supported by the Graham Foundation. Leslie Loco from the UJ has put it out. And that writing has been about, interestingly, some gardens called the Gardens of Europe, which are from an informal settlement near the airport in Cape Town, which is, the informal settlement's name is Europe. And it's next to Barcelona, which is also an informal settlement. And it's mostly people who work there, who live there, are working in Cape Town Airport. And that's because that reflects their sense of what the world is because of that relationship. And so I've been looking a lot at the gardens. I'm very interested in land tenure and the way that landscape is, the way that land tenure sets up landscape relationships over time in terms of land ownership, how it's divided, the relationship of those divisions to ecological systems, the way that all of those land dividing processes change everything, was something I've been really fascinated in. So I've been looking at the informal settlement to understand how its subdivisional processes that are informal have happened. In the process of visiting them, I noticed all of these gardens. And it's fascinating because in the Xhosa language, there's no word for garden indigenously. The word is isi garden. In the same way the word for Coke is isi Coke. They put isi on front of the Western term. And so in those spaces, garden for them is a highly exciting thing, because I would say, don't you guys want to be growing vegetables here? And they'd say, no, this is an ornamental space. And so we have an idea about gardens that might be that people who have nothing would not want to do something that is about the aesthetic or is about the ornamental, but it's quite the opposite sometimes, And so those kind of thinking things for me have been really exciting to try to understand. I think at the moment we have an idea that everything has to be functional and everything has to raise money and all of those things, and that's the default position. And I think that's changed the relationship of landscape to city and garden and all of those things. We know that we've seen the productive landscape thing become massive. But I think in a way there's a lot to be said for instance, high maintenance. Like in South Africa, labour is actually very cheap and very available, and employment is something that everybody wants. And so in actual fact, the idea of saying rather than a low maintenance landscape, talking about a high maintenance landscape, a highly engaged landscape of work and production and people doing stuff, is actually something that's highly desirable. Those type of things have changed a few of the categories and ways that I've been thinking. In terms of the second part of your question, academics and, it's a travelling game, right? So gardens are not really great if you're travelling. Gardens need you to put your feet down and say, this is my place. All of the gardens I'm looking at are people that had them for 20 years or 30 years or 100 years. And so in a way, it's a sort of weird thing to talk about something. My project should be, I'm going to put my feet down, I'm going to start this garden, I'm going to work on it for 20 years. But in actual fact, my lifestyle, the way that I've chosen to be this travelling game, doesn't actually suit this. So there's probably as many contradictions in there as findings. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I've been at this also about 35 years professionally. And I would classify myself, even though I'm a landscape architect, as a landscape gardener. And So just to say that for those of you who maybe don't get your hands dirty every day, this has been a brilliant discussion, and I want to thank you for bringing it to Chicago. So my question is, given that the Graham Foundation's in Chicago, our practice here, a lot of the times shadows that we have such a wonderful nursery and the restoration practices of ecology, a lot of them were founded in this region because of our prairie resource. And excuse me about the cough, but I speak to some friends, Germany and Pete Udolph, et cetera, and they say that they come here for our plants. So we have the plants as a resource, and the Germans propagate them and tell us how great they are. So I would like to just think if there's some time that you decide to come to this region and apply these theories and your thoughts, because even though we may practice in this area, but frankly speaking, we don't sit and think of them and articulate them like you do. And also in comparing maybe the resource that we have here to some of these great gardens of the world and places that you visited would be really fascinating.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's, as I say, I've spent a little bit of time here, and I've seen some of the classics, Jensen and Caldwell and some of those things. And so I think it's a fascinating thing. I mean, it's perplexing to me that I write about these places that are hyper-fertile when I'm living in places that have the opposite situation. It's weird. And I would love to learn more about the plants here. I mean, just look, like, what is this whole ornamental cabbage thing going on here at the moment? You go to the streets, like every other place has got like a kale and cabbage garden. It's exciting. It's exciting. It's like my wife was saying to me that, if this was South Africa, those cabbages would be gone in like 2 seconds. There's absolutely no chance you'd have an ornamental cabbage on the street,
I just had a question about pruning. I wonder if you could recommend resources about learning about the science of pruning and perhaps the art of it.
I mean, I think that, I would always approach, there's a lot about pruning in this book. And I think that there's a great book on, the main book I would go, it's like, I wouldn't actually study so much. I have funny old books on pruning. Like, I'm a big collector of like old books about horticulture. And so I have, I would suggest, the place to go to those is to go to some second-hand stores and go to the gardening section. You probably find them. But there's a book by a guy called Bell about plant morphology, which I refer to a lot. And I think that the best way to understand pruning is to understand plant morphology. And for me, that's been my major go-to thing, because every pruning process simulates a predation process, basically. And so really learning about plant pruning via plant morphology and digging into how it happens, because it's sort of like every plant is a record of those processes. So the morphology, which is the form of it, is a record of a physiological process and a history of predation and change. But each one of them happens through a kind of like an act. And I think morphology is the place to go for that. And this book by Bell on plant morphology by Timber Press, I think, is a really good one.
Julian, thank you for that talk. That was great. And I'm not exactly sure where this question is going, so maybe we can formulate it into something. But one of the things that you talked about that really interested me is this idea of anti-fragility. And you said that if you...
It's not my term, it's Nicholas Nussenteller's.
Right. But I love this idea. And when you were speaking about it, I was thinking about a story that I recently heard about post-traumatic stress, and that there's now a lot of studies on vets that are coming back, and they're discovering that there's something called post-traumatic growth. After post-traumatic stress, they're seeing that a lot of people will have the same sort of reaction. It's essentially whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
And I was very curious about that in terms of in the plant world. If you have other ideas about how that might be able to be harnessed or thought about in different ways, how it could be used within the design discipline.
I think that, that's the book by Nassim Taleb, Anti-Fragility, is the place I would go to discover that and to write about it. And I think if you haven't read him, he's a pretty funny guy. He's very opinionated, but he's really interesting. I mean, he's one of these people who he wrote this book called Black Swan, which is where he said everyone's expecting the financial markets to operate in a certain sort of way because nobody's seen a black swan before. They assume all swans are white until a black swan comes along and changes everything. And so he became significant because he recognised the GFC was going to happen because of these assumptions about linearity in the markets that were actually going on at the time, and assumptions based on assumptions. But anyway, and so anti-fragility, he also taught the term that there's also hormesis, which is to say that and he uses he's a bit of one of those old guys who fancies himself as a bodybuilder. And so he also talks about it in terms of the muscle analogy, which is about stressing the muscle and the fact that the muscle comes back with more growth out of that process. And so that's a fundamental characteristic of, every organism essentially, because organisms if they're always they can't just maintain their position. They always have to be competing for a better situation. So there's no long-term future for something which is just maintaining its position. Ultimately, it has to be able to move forward. In terms of, as an analogy, what I look at in my PhD more than my book was around that idea of that as a practice across. I do another one in my PhD where I talk about the inorganic and growth, to say, in actual fact, landscape materials can also transform over time by using erosive forces and by sequencing degradation and by working with the idea that details can change over time and that you could detail something to have a time dimension to it. And so something that a lot of artists have played with. And so it might be that you work with a material where, the classic example I used in my PhD was Bordeaux Botanic Gardens by Catherine Mosbach, where she created this series of simulated sort of soil profiles of these mounds. And what happens with those mounds is essentially they've got a kind of a mixture between soil and cement on the edge. And even though she didn't design them deliberately in this way, what happened was the topography on the surface meant that when the rain fell, the water then ran over the edge. And the amount of cement stabilizer in that edge would determine how long that edge lasted for. And so I said, what if we turned that around, instead of us pursuing permanence, and this is where I had a bit of a sort of I disagreed with Neil Kirkwood on this idea of endurance of materials. I said maybe another thing is working with transformation of materials. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can work with that sort of analogy outside of plant growth. Yeah.
Thank you. I think with that, we'd love to invite you all downstairs for a glass of wine. Thank you. Thank you so much, Julian.
Thank you.